Welcome to Aurora Institute's webinar on exploring innovative school models in the Canopy Project's interactive national database. Thank you all for choosing to be with us today. My name is Natalie Slocum. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Director here at Aurora Institute, and I will be helping to moderate today's session. Next slide, please. And before I introduce our esteemed presenters today, I just wanted to share some brief housekeeping details. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to please use the chat box to introduce yourself, ask questions, comment, and share any other insights or experiences that you have throughout today's session. We encourage a really rich dialogue and look forward to learning from you all as well. And we invite you to share what you're learning on social media. Feel free to tag us on Twitter at Aurora_INST. And this way we can share our learnings with our networks there as well. And today's session is being recorded and will be archived on Aurora Institute's website. We'll be sending a follow-up email after the webinar that includes the full slide deck and the full recording. So you'll have access to all of this information to refer back to. Next slide, please. And with that, we are grateful to have our terrific panel of speakers here with us today. We have Chelsea Waite from Christensen Institute, Yusuf Chowkhury from Transcend, Mebin Rash from Education NC, and Dr. Angie Mullenix from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And with that, I will send a last reminder to please mute yourself so that we can all hear our panelists today. And I will turn it over to Chelsea to get us started. Chelsea, it's all you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'm already seeing so many familiar names in the chat. So really excited to be here with all of you. My name is Chelsea Waite. I'm a research fellow at the Christensen Institute, where my work is focused in large part on documenting and analyzing the evolution of student-centered learning. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that David Nitkin, my colleague from Transcend, is sort of my partner in crime and co-lead in many ways on implementing this project, and couldn't make it today due to a last-minute family issue that came up. So we're really grateful that Yusuf is here in David's place. So to kick us off, I want to share a really simple conviction, and that's that innovation is possible in any school in America. And on that front, this year has sort of let the cat out of the bag to some extent. Many schools are realizing as messy as it's been to rise to the challenges of COVID-19, reverting fully back to normal isn't really an attractive option because the norm in K-12 schooling isn't always designed to produce equitable and thriving learning communities. And so as a result, breaking the status quo could actually become the status quo in K-12. And to see how, we can look for inspiration to schools from all across the country that are developing novel and unconventional solutions to longstanding problems in the sector and reimagining what success looks like for students. And so then the question becomes, so where are those schools? It turns out that's a question that has a deceptively complicated answer. It's complicated in part because the answer is one of those where what you know depends very much on whom you know. I don't know if folks are seeing, oh, I realize we want to launch the poll, Natalie, if that's okay. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to respond both to your role and sort of where you sit, as well as the most common way you learn about innovative schools. And as you're doing that, my research in large part has shown from early on in this project that people tend to rely heavily on their networks to learn about schools that are breaking the mold. And as I'm seeing poll results coming in, I'm seeing communities of practice and other networks as a major source of information, media being maybe second, and then word of mouth comes in third. My guess is that many of you have asked colleagues and in turn been asked for tips on where to visit, what schools to visit, or whom to talk to. And I've actually seen how even people with lots of colleagues to learn from tend to have sort of a persistent suspicion that they're missing information from people who are outside of their circles. And meanwhile, people without a strong network of folks to learn from are left trying to hunt down information from a variety of fairly disparate sources online to learn about schools to visit or schools that they can learn from. And this is an individual challenge, but it sort of has field-wide consequences and system-wide consequences of siloed and inaccessible information. For example, relying only on networks and sort of word of mouth buzz about innovative schools can lead some schools to go viral, if you will, while many others remain under the radar. And that dynamic can mean that school system leaders, policymakers, and funders could be missing out on tremendous lessons to be learned from traditional district schools, from schools that are embedded in marginalized communities, and from schools that are operating with limited resources. Secondly, uneven and siloed information can mean that it's really hard for those of us who are invested in supporting school transformation and personalized learning to get an accurate read on where promising approaches are taking root or how widespread an approach is becoming. And lastly, and this is an idea that I feel really strongly about, it means that as a field, we can risk calcifying a certain mental model of what innovation looks like, as if innovation is a genus species of school, rather than a really full and vibrantly diverse ecosystem. Now, most people I talk to really believe that that sort of diverse ecosystem and biodiversity exists in school innovation, but we need a way to learn about it no matter whom you know. And so the Canopy Project has emerged as a method to envision both the trees, so individual innovative schools, if you lean into the metaphor, and the designs that they implement, as well as this kind of wider forest of schools that are innovating across the country. And so the method that we developed is made up of two components. First, we got creative about where information comes from about innovative schools. And second, we thought really carefully about how that information was structured in order to be able to capture field-wide trends. So I'll just give a quick overview of where we are with the project right now. Soon after that, I'll hand it over to Mehmet and Angie to give an example of using the data set. And by about halfway through the webinar, we're actually going to be digging into data ourselves. So where we are now. I mentioned that the project reimagines where information comes from as well as how it's structured. So in terms of where it comes from, we've asked over the last 2 years, we've asked over 300 different education organizations that represent national, regional, and local perspectives to nominate schools on their radar that are innovating at a school-wide level. 121 nominating organizations have participated so far. And that's actually resulted in the nomination of 483 unique schools. I really wished we were going to crack that 500 number, but we've got 483 unique schools that have been nominated. And then among those, 222 schools have participated in the project this year by sharing kind of on the ground details about the practices that they're implementing towards student-centered and personalized learning. What I mean by sharing details about their practices, those practices in the Canopy dataset are indicated by what we've called tags. There are a total of 91 tags in the data, down to really specific practices like one-to-one mentoring or restorative justice approaches, which can help schools really precisely describe what innovation means in their context and what it looks like. Those 91 tags didn't come from absolutely nowhere. We built that list by consulting existing frameworks from organizations like Aurora Institute, like the Learning Accelerator and KnowledgeWorks. And we've depended really heavily on our advisors and other collaborators, particularly these 9 advisors who have been with the project now for at least the full year, some of them for both of the project's years. And who bring a really wide-ranging set of perspectives to the project of fine-tuning our methodology and tagging system. We also work closely with I'll name the 4 funders on the project as really strong supporters and generous supporters. One, Lowenstein Foundation, Overdeck Family Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and Barr Foundation. So exciting to have a coalition of funders behind this, this effort to share collective knowledge. So if that gives you sort of an overview of what the project is all about, what I want to do for most of our time together today is to be able to sort of lean into that metaphor and both look at ways that we can discover trees, so individual innovative schools in the Canopy data set, as well as looking at the forest, across the forest, for trends in innovative school practice. So starting with the trees, I would love for Meben and Angie from North Carolina to jump in and share some of their experience exploring those trees that pop up in North Carolina. Meben and Angie, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, y'all. So thanks for having us today. We're delighted to be here. My name is Meben, and I'm with ednc.org, and we're a local news organization that has the privilege to be covering our students in our schools all across North Carolina. And we're also privileged enough to have a lot of funding to travel. And so we are in schools and districts day in and day out. And we don't want to miss any of our schools. And so long before COVID, we were interested in tracking innovation, both in schools and across our districts and across the system. And more specifically, we were thinking about like when innovation bubbles up from a school or when innovation is pushed into a school from a district or from a system. And we went to Singapore and realized that in Singapore, they do both. They pilot innovations in particular schools, and then when they're ready to scale them to all schools, they push those innovations down on a statewide level, countrywide level there. Statewide, it would be in North Carolina. And so we got curious about what the infrastructure for innovation looks like. What does the infrastructure look like in a school so it bubbles up? What does it look like in a district? What does it look like across the state? And then during COVID, we got worried as we saw the schools and districts in the state under tremendous pressure. And so, you know, just as an example, thinking about one of our most beloved superintendents, and early on in COVID, he tweeted this tweet that had just tremendous engagement across our state and sort of framed the debate about innovation. And it's a stark tweet, so get ready. But he says, "To all the public school haters, social media stars, self-promoters, and critical friends, we appreciate all the advice about re-envisioning education, but right now we're busy loving on our students and feeding the community. We'll catch back up with you in the fall." And so it really called into question this question of what is innovation? Of course, he was innovating. He was figuring out how to feed his kids and do digital learning with his kids, relative to the bigger systems question of how the system should innovate and how we could use this opportunity to really reshape education moving forward. And on that end of the spectrum, we would hold up an article that was in the 74 last week, and I'll put the link in the chat, that talks about the capacity of the restaurant industry to really innovate as a system during COVID and how education fell behind. So in the midst of all that, on December 6, 2020, we read an article in the 74, and the headline was "What COVID era learning looks like in 144 innovative schools around the country." And it's about how the Canopy Project schools responded to COVID. And it took us back to that question: what does the infrastructure for innovation look like in schools and districts and in systems? And I tweeted about that, and David Stegall, who's in the Department of Public Instruction, saw that and shared it with Angie Mullenix on the call today. And we started talking about what it would look like to take a deeper look at the Canopy Project schools in North Carolina. And from the standpoint of EdNC, the big question was, could this become the infrastructure of innovation in our state? So we're getting ready to go out and visit all of those schools. And then we hope to connect all of our Canopy Project schools in a learning community. And then we hope that we can use those schools and help those schools become resources for other schools in North Carolina. And all of this, we hope, will help us think about what infrastructure for a system and how we kind of take what we've learned during COVID to shapeshift education in North Carolina moving forward. And with that, I'll pass it off to Angie, who's going to talk about exactly what we're going to be taking a look at in these schools.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mebane, and thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. We're so grateful, one, for the Aurora Institute and the Canopy Project, but also that you have an interest in this as well, because that means that there's an even bigger audience who is interested in innovation and sort of sharing the knowledge about that innovation wherever you might be located. Just a little background so that we can bring us up to where we're at right now from the department's view. I came onto the department in October of 2019, so just a few months before COVID happened. And when I came on board, I was hired as the Director of Innovation Strategy. And one of the key projects that I was responsible for, which was getting off of the ground right before COVID happened, of course, it takes some planning to identify promising practices, was a promising practices project. Again, we were just at the phase of sharing this information and really getting buy-in from the department, the other divisions throughout the department, and then also from some North Carolina-based educational organizations that would help to support us in this effort. And then COVID happened and our focus really shifted. But it shifted, but in the backs of our minds, we also started thinking about, wow, these are really innovative practices that are also happening as a result of COVID. So in coming into contact with Mebane and learning more about this, and then also connecting with Transcend and Aurora Institute, we learned that a lot of this work that we were planning to do in identifying these promising practices was already being done through the Canopy Project. And so knowing that that was always the direction we wanted to go in, we reached out and made that connection. And we really did that for our original reason, which was because North Carolina is a very long state by miles. So from the East Coast to the mountains, it can take you about 6, maybe 7 hours, depending on, maybe even longer than that, depending on where you start and where you end up. And so what happens is, a lot of times, as was discussed earlier when we first joined this call, a lot of times those promising practices or those innovative practices are known about because of word of mouth. So who you know. And we wanted to change that because we felt that a teacher all the way out in Cherokee County, North Carolina, should have some sort of idea of what was, sorry, can you guys still hear me? Okay, sorry, just a brief disconnection, of what was happening in, say, the far northeast of our state. And the only way to really do that would be through a promising practices database, which is our plan to build that, so that any teacher or administrator across the state could say, okay, our school demographics or our district demographics look like this. And so we are looking at approaching a project-based learning methodology in our school, at least to some degree. Maybe it's 50% of the instructional time, and then the other 50%, maybe it looks more traditional. And so we're going to use this database and we're going to search to find similar schools to ours. And so the purpose of these site visits is that we'll go and lay eyes on these Canopy schools, as Mebane said, and we'll talk to the administrators, the teachers, and the students to learn more about these promising practices. And then we will take this information, just as you would any sort of research project. We'll really dig in and take all of the data and sort it and put it in an infographic form and a video form, and then store it on that database so that when they're searching, they can find those resources and get a glimpse into the promising practices. And then if they want to reach out further and maybe they want to invest some of their funding into those site visits, then they can choose to do that. But at least they would know where they would want to do that at. So it's a very intentional approach to connect our state in all areas across the state and help identify those innovative practices, those creative practices that are happening.
Great. I am loving from your stories, Mebane and Angie. First of all, Mebane, the nugget that you shared about the school leader who was saying, you know, like, stop bugging me about innovation. I'm heads down, making things work. And it sort of gets to this issue around, like, what is our mental model of innovation, that we don't think what he's doing is innovating, or not everybody does, or he doesn't think that what he's doing is innovating, right? And I think that's something that the Canopy Project is trying to break through a little bit. And Angie, you know, to both of you, really appreciating the way that this work is progressing in North Carolina with sort of a head start from some of the cataloging that we've already begun to do. And I think that's really the idea here, is that we can give people kind of a head start on any of this cataloging, connecting folks, creating learning communities, which we all really need to do. And if there's a place where you can start to learn what's out there and who's doing what, it can put you a few steps ahead. So I really appreciate that. So we've now seen sort of an example of using the Canopy to identify trees in the forest of innovative schools. Now I want to talk about the forest. So if you want to learn more, I should mention, if you want to learn more about finding trees, make sure to join the breakout group at the end of the session with Yusuf, where he'll be going into how to use the data portal and where you can access all those filters that you saw on the screen. So just to note that. So transitioning to look a little bit at the forest, and this is the part where I'll share a chart and talk over it a little bit, but then I'm also going to give everybody a tool to look at where you can explore some of the data yourselves and reflect and react. So I mentioned earlier that every school uses a set of 91 tags to represent the practices that they're implementing or not implementing. Each tag has a name and a description in case school leaders need some clarification on what it means. And all those tags are accessible online. In the survey, once school leaders select all the practices that they're implementing, next we ask them to pick up to 5 of those practices that they see as really core to what they do. These 5 practices are part of our central DNA as a school. And then we ask leaders to report on how long they've been implementing each of those 5 core practices. And so the chart that I wanted us to focus on mostly today is focusing on those core practices. So in this chart, you can see the results of school leaders' responses to the chart is showing the top 10 practices that school leaders report as core. And those 10 practices are arranged from most common on the left to least common on the right. And then the colors in the chart indicate how long that they've been implemented, with purple being 5 or more years. On the other end, green is less than 1 year of implementation. And that y-axis is showing the number of schools out of a total of 222 that we have recent data on that report those practices as core. So right off the bat, before we sort of dive deeper individually, there are a couple things that I want to point out from this chart that I think we can learn. First of all, SEL, social emotional learning, is clearly a widespread priority for schools. Not only is it the most commonly cited core practice, but if you actually look on the far right-hand side of the chart, you can see that SEL that's integrated across the academic curriculum is also among the most commonly cited core practices. We can also see sort of a theme around project-based learning as a common priority for schools. PBL is the second most common core practice. And then when we also see real-world problem solving and interdisciplinary appearing in these top 10 as well. And then let's take a look too at how long all these practices have been implemented. Just taking those 2 that we were just discussing, PBL and SEL, social emotional learning. The chart suggests that most schools that prioritize PBL in their models, in other words, most schools that report PBL as core, have been doing it for a long time, the majority actually for 5 or more years. Competency-based education and family and community support services also are showing up as fairly mature practices on average. And by contrast, there are 2 practices in this chart that show up as relatively newer on average. One would be blended learning, and another would be designing for equity. Now, I think we could talk about this chart for a while longer, but I actually want to add one layer. For good reason, we've been looking at the top 10 practices that school leaders cite as core to what they do, because it's really useful to know what's most common across the data set. But it turns out that frequency, only looking at the most common core practices, isn't the only interesting question to ask. So here's the same chart as on the last slide, but it extends the x-axis. It shows all the practices that any school reported as core. And what you're seeing here is sort of what we referred to as a long tail. So although the practices on the left are clearly most common, almost all practices, 78 out of the 91, were identified by one or more school leaders as a core practice. So before we even sort of look at the chart more deeply, I'm really struck by this message that no practice clearly dominates as a central attribute in all innovative school models. Take even the most common practices that we're seeing here. SEL is reported as a core practice in 87 schools, but that's actually only 39% of the 222 schools that we have data for. And so this is exciting as sort of a forest level view, because it shows how there's such wide variety in schools' innovative models, and no single set of practices really defines what innovative means in K-12 schools. So instead of listening to me talk more about this, I'd like us to explore this data ourselves. So I'm going to stop the presentation, and if you click the link that's in the chat, you should be led to this screen where you can actually interact with some of this data yourself. So if you hover over each of these colored blocks, it'll show you how many schools have identified that practice as core and for how long. And that's true if you go all the way down to the end of that long tail. If you need to, you can also click and drag to zoom in on a particular part. So one of the areas that immediately jumped out to me is that, there's a big block of green, so less than a year of implementation for asynchronous online learning, as well as synchronous online learning. And that's probably not particularly surprising to anyone given the circumstances we're in this year, but really interesting to see that coming through in the data. And then you double click to get out of that zoom view. So I actually would like to just take 5 minutes. I'm going to put on some music. You can get in the zone. And I'd love to just give folks a chance to browse this chart and share your reflections publicly in the Padlet that we've added here. So that Padlet link will go in the chat as well. And if you can be sharing 2 categories of reflections. One is questions. So if you have questions about the project or about the data, questions that arise in your head because of the data, put them in that questions category. And then reactions, which might be like ahas or things that struck you or observations that you have. So I'm going to go ahead and put on some music here, and we'll just take 5 minutes to explore. right, I think I'll stop our club music right there. That doesn't mean you need to stop reflecting in the Padlet, but I am going to transition us to looking at a few of these questions that have come through. So let me just bring up our presentation again. I'm going to start addressing some of the questions that have come through on the Padlet as well as in the chat. And I may tap Meb and Angie and even Yusuf, if you don't mind, on the shoulder to reflect a little bit on some of these answers as well. I've seen a few questions that have to do with how the tags were determined along with their descriptions and how we reached those conclusions. I'm going to put a link here in the chat that I haven't shared yet. The Airtable link that I just put in the chat is to the full list of tags. So you can see there that that all of the tags are listed along with their descriptions. The descriptions for each tag, where possible, came from existing frameworks that are out there from some of the organizations that have participated in the project's design, as well as other, white papers and research that's been done to do some definitional work around these terms. Though I'm seeing a couple questions that came in reflecting on how many of these terms can be interpreted in different ways, even if we shared a specific definition. How do we know that that's really how people are interpreting what project-based learning means, for example? And that's actually where I think this tagging system can be sort of a learning engine in itself, because as you're looking through the tags, you'll find that some of them get much deeper into the details of some of those big concepts like project-based learning or blended learning. So I'll just give one example and then let folks explore themselves or ask more specific questions. But with regards to project-based learning, for example, there's a tag about students developing projects. So are students partners and leaders in designing and implementing projects, or do teachers develop projects? So that can be one way to start to narrow in on, if a school has indicated project-based learning, what other specific practices can help us to understand how they're doing that. Another example is in the competency-based education space. So many schools might call themselves competency-based, but we know that those approaches can really vary. And so some of the more specific tags can help us to get a better picture in a given school about what competency-based learning means to them. And I will say up front, this strategy is ever evolving. So we're learning a lot about how schools are using tags and what meaning the tags can give us in terms of specific practices that are being adopted. Get back here to our questions. Yes, just validating a lot of comments on the varied definitions for so many of these terms. And again, to say that the evolution of the tagging system really needs to attend to the ways that these terms are continuing to be better defined over time as a combination of research and practice kind of hone in on what does it really mean to do competency-based learning or blended learning in a variety of ways. Let's see. Yes, really appreciating so much of this commentary. It's, as always, hard to read your comments and respond without simply reading your comments back. Would Mevin, Angie, or Yusuf, would anyone, are you seeing questions and comments that you'd like to jump in on here?
I'm happy to tell a couple stories in response to some of the questions. I've been to several of the schools already that are on the North Carolina list. And, you know, there was a question about, well, some of these innovations have been around for 20 years. And so it goes to your question, Chelsea, about like, what's our mindset of innovation in this moment? And what is it relative to the trees and relative to the forest? There's one of the schools, our Tri-County Early College out in Cherokee County, way out west in North Carolina, is looked at nationally and internationally as being a leader in project-based learning. All of the learning that happens in that school takes place within the context of projects. And so the structure of how that innovative practice is being implemented with students and in a classroom is just very different than what we see anywhere else in North Carolina, even where we have project-based learning in other schools. So I'd lift that up as kind of a distinction. And then someone else asked about interest-based learning and skills related to that. And another school in North Carolina, North Edgecombe High School, gave 30 students the opportunity to redesign school from the ground up and think about exactly that. What skills did they need to learn relative to their interests? And if they could build school differently, how would they do it? And that informed, that 1 year pilot informed taking the practices that emerged and how they wanted school to be constructed, and then scaling that across 3 grades. And then now they're trying to scale it across schools and eventually connecting all of the schools in that feeder network from elementary to middle to high with those practices. It's just an example of how one district tried to take innovation from students themselves and let it bubble up out of students and then ripple out across a 30 student classroom, and then the school, and then 3 grades, and then across, you know, and kept going with those innovations.
So that's a great example, Mevin. Thank you.
And I'll just add to that too, that I think it's important to remember that, you know, people are on here from all different places. And certainly there are, you know, pockets across the country that are really very innovative school districts on the whole. For us in particular, we have, you know, pockets of those across our state, but then we also have some very traditional schools that, while yes, some of these practices such as project-based learning might have been around for many years, that does not necessarily mean that that's a component that's in the schools. And so what we want to do is help to bring to light some of those more authentic learning experiences. But even beyond that, as Mevin said, you know, innovation is a creative way to solve a problem. There are lots of problems in education. You know, we have a teacher pipeline problem, right? Where we have teacher shortages, and that's across the country. And it's really being amplified since COVID, because this is a strain on teachers. For a variety of reasons. And so Edgecombe, that was mentioned, has a teacher scholar program where they have a homegrown program that is building teacher capacity. Those are also promising practices. So lots of different ways that that school districts are being creative to solve the problems that they face. And it's not so much a matter of saying, hey, if you have a problem, this is how you can solve it. It's more of saying, you know, this is how one district or school identified an issue and they work to resolve it. And it helps to then feed ideas to those other schools who might be looking to solve a similar issue and need some ideas, or sort of that, okay, they did it, so we can do it too. You know, we might have to modify based on our particular school, where it's at, demographics, funding, whatever things it might be. But it's really that helping to kind of give that like permission to say, look how creative you can be, and sharing that across the state.
Totally. And just picking up on a couple of the themes I'm hearing, one of them is that by casting a really wide net on what it means to be innovative, the project has opportunities to serve a variety of questions that folks might have. So if you're really looking for only the subset of schools that are completely sort of breaking some of the conventional kind of grammar of schooling, then you might be able to filter by a certain set of tags that would allow you to see, you know, is the school using multi-age classrooms? So are they actually getting away from age-graded models? That might be one kind of filter that you could apply to look for schools that are really getting away from some of that grammar of schooling. On the other hand, folks might be most interested in where are the schools that are working in rural environments that are figuring out ways for students to design their own projects. This is an example of that might not be a totally new practice. I don't think innovative always means new, but it might be a really difficult practice to implement in a certain circumstance. And so you can use the Canopy to identify schools in those circumstances to learn from. There is so much richness in this Padlet right now. And so I actually want to transition us to breakout groups to be able to dig into it further. I just want to address one more sort of tactical question that came through about whether we track if schools abandon a core practice. And the answer to that, I think, is really exciting because as the project continues on over time, we will be able to have that data. So just now we have only 2 years of data and we're starting to see some interesting changes over time. And as we go on, we should be able to see more of those shifts over time and be able to understand how school innovation sort of as a practice is evolving over the years. So much more to discuss. So let's jump into breakout groups. This is going to be the last thing we do in this session. We didn't want to, bring everybody back for kind of a concluding bit. We just wanted to let you discuss. So there are 2 options for a discussion if you'd like to do that. The first one is sort of taking the tree perspective, or excuse me, the forest perspective. So your views on sort of the state of school innovation, what are the things that you're most trying to learn this year about innovation in schools? That's breakout group 1, and I'd love for you to join me for that conversation. Breakout group 2 is going to be with Yusuf from Transcend, and we'll focus on using the Canopy data portal and the data that we make publicly available to find schools. So honing in on those individual trees. So that's breakout group 2. If you need to leave us, I'd encourage you to click on that survey where we can get some valuable feedback. It's just a 1-minute survey so that we can always continue to improve these offerings for webinars from the Aurora Institute.